So we're talking about kind of an evidence-based view of what hunter-gatherer life is like, right, from like anthropology. But then most of Western thought seems to be informed by these kinds of formative years of colonialism, where you have people like Thomas Hobbes, kind of this philosopher, effectively functioning as a kind of propagandist for saying that life in non-state-based societies is awful, nasty, brutish, and short, right? It's the famous phrase. And that it's a kind of a solitary, constant struggle to survive, right? Which seems very different to, I mean, it seems to be just being plucked out of the air, right? As a kind of, it really has the flavor of propaganda to me rather than philosophy or science.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, Thomas Hobbes didn't know anything about the way people actually lived in, the pre-state world. It was all conjecture. And like everyone else, his sort of instinctive bias was to say, the world that contains me is the best world, right? I mean, we do it, ask a Frenchman what the best culture in the world is. And, the odds are pretty high he's going to say France, right? And ask an Australian, he'll say Australia. So we do the same thing with historical epochs. We say, well, I live now, so this is the best. And then we have this narrative of perpetual progress saying, well, the most recent is always the best. Update your software. It's the best version, right? Update your computer. It's the newest, strongest, fastest. It's the best. So we do the same thing with society, although, they're really, if you look at the evidence, things start to look very differently. But every society loves, you have a big bug flying around in your studio there, don't you? It's funny. Sometimes it flies in front of the camera.
Yeah.
Like, man, that's a pterodactyl in there.
Yeah. It's a little Easter egg.
Anyway, yeah, you should just pluck it out of the air and eat it. Because, one of the interesting contributors to this misconception is that, when someone from Europe goes to the New World and they don't understand how things work there, they starve. So there's the famous story of, the pilgrims and the local Indians had to come and show them, like, no, here's how you grow something here. You have to put a little fish in the hole to fertilize the seed and da-da-da-da-da. Because the soil is different from what you're used to in England or France or, whatever. So what happens is you go to a new environment, you don't know how things work, you don't know what's edible, you don't understand the seasons and the soil and everything else. And so you starve. And the ones who don't starve or who, take back the stories say, oh my God, everyone's starving over there. But they're starving because you don't know how things work there, not because there's no food there. You just don't know what's edible. So I often think of, I don't know if I wrote about this in the book or not, but there's a film by Werner Herzog called Rescue Dawn, starring Christian Bale. I don't know if you've seen that. It's about a pilot who shot down in the Vietnam War. He shot down over Laos and taken to a prisoner of war camp. And, they're all starving because, the Viet Cong hardly feed them anything. And so Christian Bale escapes from the prisoner of war camp, and he is, going through the jungle trying to get back to the Americans. And he gets caught by a group of Viet Cong. And he's been starving. He was starving at the camp, of course, but now he's been starving in the 5 or 6 days that he was going through the jungle, totally starving. There's a scene where he catches a snake and pounds its head on a rock and eats this raw snake. And, Werner Herzog, being Werner Herzog, he actually made Christian Bale eat a dead snake, on camera. And he lost 40 pounds for the role or something. But anyway, there's this scene where he's captured by the Viet Cong and they're taking him back to the camp and they're going along this path. And one of the Vietnamese guys breaks a sapling and sort of forms like a little tennis racket head at the top of the sapling, ties it off and then he takes some other twig and sort of wraps it around so there's a bit of a mesh and this little badminton racket thing. And then he takes some sap from a tree and smears it on this tennis racket. And then they get back on the trail and they start jogging down the trail. And there are these bugs, these big, like locust looking bugs that are flying around. And every once in a while, one flies near the guy and he puts up his tennis racket and the bug sticks to the sap that he's put on there. And then you just see him do this a few times as they're going down this path. And then they stop, another rest stop, and they light a little fire. And this guy takes his little badminton racket, he puts it over the fire, and he roasts these bugs. And they're like shrimp. And then he eats these delicious bugs. And you see Christian Bale just looking at him like, oh my God, like these things were around the whole time. I had no idea you could eat them. There's flying shrimp all over the place here, right? It's just like this incredible sense that we have that, like, because I don't know how to live here, this place is inhospitable. This place is impossible to live in. Whereas people who've been living here for generations, they know perfectly well how to live there.
Yeah, I mean, it's like most animals don't look like they're running around kind of confused and as to where to find food. They tend to kind of occupy niches where they instinctively know what to do, right? Yeah. It's not doesn't seem to be that stressful a way to live. But yeah, I mean, so with Hobbes, you also, linking back to what we were talking about with fear earlier. Yeah, was it he who said that his mother gave birth to twins, him and fear?
Yeah, because the Spanish Armada was like just off the coast when he was born. Everyone knew that things were going to be really bad really soon. And then and then his whole life was just, one disaster after another. He was exiled from England because of something he'd written, and his books were burned, and there was a death sentence on him. So he fled to France, and then I forget if they were Dutch or there was some other war, and he was on the wrong side of that. So then he had to flee somewhere else. He was just constantly running for his life. And when he was writing Leviathan, he had some terrible illness, or he thought he was going to die. He was like in bed for 3 months. I mean, the guy's life was really hard. And, so he projected a lot of his personal experience onto prehistory and just assumed, like, well, if this is the best, it must have been really bad back then, So yeah, it's not science. It's more psychology, I think, than anything else.
Yeah, I think this, as you say, this projection onto nature is just seeing it all as like existence as just being hostile and negative, where it's really his issues, really, rather than an objective look at nature. And I guess one of the other things is this idea that it was a constant war of all against all, right? Whereas the actual evidence seems to suggest that if you don't have accumulated resources, there isn't really any point in going to war, and bands of people can seem to kind of get along just fine occupying the same kind of area.
Yeah. There is, if population remains steady and remains in a, correlated with resources, as it does with all animals, then there's really nothing to fight about, right? It's when population starts growing, then access to resources becomes constricted and conflictive, whether that's because of agriculture or some other reason, as we described earlier, where there was sort of a natural sequence of events that led to higher population and then reduction in resources. There's really nothing to fight about. One of the things Hobbes said, his whole quote, the part that's really well known is nasty, brutish, and short, but the quote is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He was wrong on every one of those counts. As you allude to, solitary. Humans never have been solitary. We are, and always have been, an extremely social species. Chimps and bonobos, which are extremely closely related to us, are both very highly social species. And so, we've never been solitary. More people live alone right now than have ever lived alone in the entire history of our species. And that leads to severe psychological damage, whether we're talking about old people who are living alone in apartments, or prisoners who are sentenced to solitary confinement. To think about how important society is to us, think about the fact that the worst of the worst of the worst are sentenced to solitude, right? People in prisons would rather be with the general population, which includes guys, who are going to beat the hell out of you in the shower, or maybe stick a shiv in your back, or, they're not the kind of people you would generally want to hang out with. But prisoners would out with other prisoners than be in solitary confinement. That's how bad it is. So, we are not a solitary species. Poor, relates to poverty, is an invention of agriculture. Hunter-gatherer people don't feel impoverished because everyone has what they need and everyone has roughly the same. Poverty is a relative concept, right? I'm impoverished relative to you, not relative to any sort of objective standard. So solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, we've talked about that a fair bit. And short, people still believe that we've doubled the human lifespan. And this astounds me. This is a wall I've been banging my head against for 20 years. And I've just accepted that, the wall's going to outlast my head for sure. But people believe that, everyone died at 35. There's a New Yorker cartoon that almost made me cancel my subscription. There's a couple of, cavemen sitting there. And the one guy says, I just don't get it. All our food is organic. The water's clean. The air is clean. And still we all die at 35. I thought, oh my God, even the New Yorker, where's your fact checkers? So just to put that to rest, Homo sapiens, our species, typically lives into its 70s and 80s. The only reason anyone says that the average lifespan is 35 is because they're including infant mortality, which is quite high in most hunter-gatherer groups. So if you have, 30% of babies die within the first 5 or 6 years of life, and you count them statistically, you add them to the pool, life expectancy at birth will be under 40 years. But that doesn't mean that any human being has ever been old at 35. That's not how it works.